Hello, and welcome to the Astrology Hotline, where we answer your questions about your birth chart or about astrology in general. Today is Saturday, July 3rd. My name is Tristan Paylor, and co-hosting with me today is Kyle Pierce.
Hello, everyone.
We're both professional astrologers with an eclectic approach built on the foundation of Hellenistic astrology. And we've got a couple of listener questions to share with you today and interpret. Do you want to go ahead and introduce our first question, Kyle?
Sure, we can go ahead and get started. So our first question is from Katie. Katie asks, transiting Mars opposite natal Mars, how does that often present? Especially now with Mars in a T-square with Saturn and Uranus. I'm having a major case of the I don't cares right now, and I have a feeling it is because of the pileup of planets involved in this T-square. Uranus is conjoined my natal Cryon in Taurus right now, too. And Mars is sitting on my natal North Node, about to conjoin my natal Mars. The overall energy lately has been, what am I doing with my life? Can I sustain this current work I'm doing? And why am I bothering anymore? Lots of listless, I don't have the drive or care feelings. So, Katie, excellent question. I was really eager to answer this one because it involves a really significant aspect pattern that I think is really characterizing the current astrological weather. But I also happen to be kind of in the crosshairs of it. So I'm definitely feeling it. I have a Sun-Jupiter conjunction, about 12-ish degrees of Taurus. So it's right kind of in the heart of the action. So, to address the first part of your question, transiting Mars opposite natal Mars, that's going to vary a lot depending on, what else is involved in a transit. I think in a general sense, I think of it kind of like, in terms of phase, like a full moon. So maybe kind of like the culminating phase of the Mars cycle as it pertains to your chart and what it points to in your chart. But I think in this case, we really got to put it in the context of, the current transit. How would you typically read transiting Mars opposing natal Mars, Tristan?
The first thing I think about is the nature of the aspect itself. The natures of the aspects get some of their significations from the planet they're associated with, and the opposition is the aspect of Saturn. So it has the character of delays and frustrations, putting things on hold, challenges and setbacks, a need to find balance, that sort of thing. So while you might think any sort of Mars aspect might be energizing, I'd expect the Mars opposition to be, when you think about its place in the cycle of Mars aspects, like, Kyle was just sort of touching on, it's the point where whatever projects Mars has been working on get kind of put on hold or challenged or questioned in some way. So with transits, I like to look at the cycle of the aspects. I like to look at the last aspect the transiting planet made to the relevant planet. So the last time Mars made an aspect to your natal Mars, it made a trine aspect from the beginning of March to the end of April when Mars was in Gemini. So if you look back on that period and maybe identify some themes that are connected to what Mars represents in your chart, you might notice that stuff that you were working on then has been kind of put on hold now. If you were pushing yourself too hard, the Mars opposition can represent a time of burnout.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Oppositions do have that nature, nature of Saturn. I sort of think that, it obviously depends on the planet involved, but I think that it kind of has that quality in part because of it being sort of a ripeness or a fullness of that cycle. Kind of like you finished your first draft and you're kind of submitting it for review. And that's when you kind of maybe become like aware of all the problems with, whatever that project is. So, I think there's already kind of built in to the transit, like a reassessment. How am I going to move on to the next phase? The sort of culminating, or not culminating, the disseminating phase where you kind of proceed, offload, sort of carry forward with the project.
I've actually I've had this transit recently. My Mars is in Capricorn in the seventh house. So when I was reading your question, that made me think about my own experience during that transit, and also made me look back at what was going on the time previously when Mars made a trine aspect. I won't get into, the minutia of my own chart, so I'll just focus on, Mars being in my seventh house and being opposed from my first house. And uh, the previous part of the cycle when I had Mars trine Mars was not long after my partner and I moved into a new place. And, I think it was actually during that transit of Mars trine my natal Mars that we, finally finished unpacking the living room, and we were, becoming accustomed to a new routine as a couple in a new space. And, that was all fine and dandy. And, trines are often easy and not all that noticeable. So then when the Mars opposition comes around, sometimes, that can represent a time of those things being challenged. And when Mars opposed my Mars, my partner got pretty sick. He's fine. Everything's okay. But the sort of routine that we had established as a couple in our space, and the division of responsibilities that had become a routine was kind of shaken up, and I had to take on more responsibility, just, Mars and Capricorn. And then, during that period, I also sustained a minor injury to my hand. And one of the extra responsibilities I, was taking on around the house was bringing the chickens outside in the morning. And it's this whole contraption with a rope. And it's very hard to do when I don't have a serious injury, but it was enough. Like there was some bruising on my hand that it made it difficult. So it was just like kind of one thing after another that was kind of shaking things up and, forcing me to certain Mars related projects that I had on the go, in my work life or in my personal life were kind of, delayed or disrupted. And I mean, none of this was, a huge deal or anything like that. And everything is fine. But, I don't tell these stories to scare anyone, but it just seemed symbolically very fitting. That's just sort of one thing after another, getting in the way, walls in front of you kind of experience.
Yeah, that's making me think of, again, I don't want to get too off track because I want to, we want to talk about like the aspect pattern in general, but I think with like, yeah, the Mars opposition and that kind of point in the cycle, it's like Mars is very directed, has a goal that it's, can be pretty single-minded. And I think the opposition is kind of when things catch up with Mars, maybe when all the minutia catches up, all the sort of issues and details that maybe hinder or create obstacles. I think about it as like with Mars, I always have to use like war analogies, but like when you're on a campaign and you've like invaded, the enemy country, and you've gotten so far into enemy territory, you've taken all this land, and at that point you have to kind of consolidate your resources. Everything's kind of all spread out. The peasants are revolting. You gotta kind of deal with everything that you've gained so far before you can make any more progress.
Well, one thing, I do want to say, when you're looking at planets in your chart that are affected by transits, I think something that my example really drove home for me is that you're not only looking at, your own subjective experience and what's happening to you, but also the people around you, because the planets in your chart represent people in your life as well. And, this pile up of, planets in T square that are transiting through your chart are transiting through the angular houses, the fourth, the seventh, and the 10th, which are the most, I mean, for one, those are the most sort of active, prominent areas of life. And that can certainly represent a lot. If there's any tension between those three areas of life, those tensions can, come to a head. But, with the fourth house and the seventh house in particular, those houses also relate to other people. And so, with my experience of Mars opposition Mars, like my partner had it a whole lot worse than I did. He's the one who actually got sick. I was fine. I had a very, minor hand injury. There was nothing to complain about. But, he was not having a great time. And sometimes those malefic transits, can show up that way where you've got Mars in the fourth house and Saturn is transiting over that, which, compounds the opposition, with that sense of frustration and things being slowed down or maybe burnout. But that's stuff that like maybe roommates or family members might also be encountering some of those themes in their own lives. And those situations in their lives also have an impact on your own. So that's something to be mindful of too when you're interpreting transits, I think. I mean, obviously your experience is that you are feeling these themes playing out personally, and Mars happens to rule your first house, so that makes a ton of sense. That this would be affecting you on a very personal level as well. But it's worth sort of thinking about other people in your life too, what they're going through and how that might be affecting how you're feeling.
For sure. I'd say almost more often than not, like a lot of like big transits, you're expecting something really significant for yourself, and it's just an issue that you're dealing with that involves somebody else, or, it's not always about you. But from what you've described, it sounds like you're feeling what I think a lot of people with sensitive points that are being hit by this transit are feeling. And I think it's going to play out very differently for, depending on, what planet's being activated. But I want to talk a little bit about it kind of generally. Actually, Tristan, did you see that clip kind of going around on the internet right now about the pipeline burst, the gas line burst in the Gulf of Mexico?
I have not seen it.
All right, I'm going to send you a quick link.
Is there literally fire in the water?
Yes. So for those who haven't seen the video, there's fire bubbling up, like emerging from the water. But it literally looks like, there's a ball of flames in the water, like the water itself is on fire.
And I mean, if that's not, when I think about the hard aspect part of aspect cycles, especially those that involve Saturn, because Saturn represents time and the consequences of our actions, I can't help looking at this and thinking, yes, here are the consequences of our actions. This is that part of, the narrative where what was done and seemed like an okay idea at the time turns out not to be such a great idea after all.
Yeah, I mean, running pipelines through the ocean of flammable gas or oil, has consequences. But I think what I find the most interesting about it, because when I think about, for anybody maybe not watching the transits, right now, Uranus is in Taurus, about 12 degrees, 13 degrees. Saturn is in Aquarius, about 12 degrees. And Mars, as of today, the 3rd of July, it's just separating from an opposition with Saturn. So the way I kind of look at it in general, I can't help but like focus on Mars and Saturn first, because like they're the most visible, kind of tangible planets. Mars and Saturn deal with very kind of opposite principles. Not completely, but Mars has a lot of momentum, and it's kind of like relentless kind of pushing forward, kind of at any cost. And so you get like sort of severing and cutting with Mars. It's just, that's in the way, I'm going to cut through it. With Saturn opposing Mars, it's creating obstacles and barriers to Mars. And I would say that these transits, generally come with frustration. And I'm actually going to nickname this one the Spirit Crusher. Leo, Mars and Leo, it can be, it's very egocentric, a very about a kind of personal drive and will. And getting what maybe you want, more or less at all costs. Mars, it wants what it wants, right? Saturn is kind of saying, no, Mars, what you want doesn't necessarily matter, or what you want is unsustainable. And Saturn, I think, is in a stronger position overall, being in its own sign. Mars, it can sort of do its thing in Leo, but it's not particularly, doesn't have any like essential dignity. But, with Uranus kind of in the square with Mars, it's really like pushing Mars forward. It's like Mars wants to go, go, go now, Together, it's like just blasting through obstacles. But Saturn is creating obstacles for Mars to blast through. And I feel like, particularly kind of at this phase in the transit, it's just kind of feeling like defeating. It's very repressive and defeating kind of configuration. I can't help but think of, with Mars and Uranus, I keep thinking like the Kool-Aid Man, how he, would bust through a wall in the party. He would like show up at the party, kind of blast through the wall like, oh yeah. And, it was never really addressed in the commercial. Everybody's like happy to see the Kool-Aid Man. But in reality, like, dude, you just blasted a hole through my house, And I think Saturn's saying like, no, come through the front door, Kool-Aid Man. And the Kool-Aid Man might just be like, no, like, what's even the point? Like, I can't make my entrance. Like, I'm not really the Kool-Aid Man if I can't blast through the wall. I think that's what this transit sort of feels like to me. It just feels like, like you don't, like, what's the point if I can't blast through the wall?
I think one thing too, when you're interpreting your own transits, is to take your perfection year into account and to perfect not only from the ascendant, but also from the sect light, whichever the sun or the moon. If you were born during the day, then the sun is your sect light, and if you were born at night, that's the moon. And perfecting from that point can also tell you a lot about the themes that are astrologically relevant that year. And looking at your perfections, Katie, Jupiter is your time lord, perfecting from your ascendant, and Jupiter is going to make their way back into Aquarius. And I've been thinking about this retrograde period as, Jupiter kind of seeing that their friends are in trouble, like, oh crap, this T square has formed since I've been gone. I better go back and help out. So, maybe Jupiter moving back into your fourth house and getting involved in the T square can start to kind of smooth things over.
Yeah, I think that configuration needs some attention from benefics. And, Venus is in the mix, but it seems like Venus is a little bit too involved to really be able to smooth anything out. She's kind of like in the mix and like, going to be in the receiving end. I think, where is Venus right now? Is it about to hit that opposition? Yeah, it's about 7 degrees. So, I mean, it's on its way. But the thing is, I don't know if you've spotted this yet, Tristan, but so Jupiter, when it retrogrades back into Aquarius, Mars is going to be exiting at like just the same time. But it's sort of like as Jupiter makes its way back into Aquarius, it's going to hit that opposition with Mars right as it's leaving. It's kind of like Mars like kicking Jupiter in the balls as he shows up, or like walking in on an argument, or like walking in like right as somebody is storming out of the room.
I like that image a lot.
Like, well, what happened? Let's deal with let's address what just happened here.
Yeah, I think in the big picture sense, Jupiter's definitely going to have their hands full, but I think at least for Katie, because Jupiter's a time lord, hopefully that provides some, hopefully that's a positive omen in your chart, Katie. On the larger scale, Jupiter's probably still going to perhaps regret walking back in that door.
Yeah. It's kind of like, I mean, I think Jupiter would rather stay in Pisces, but yeah, we need you, Jupiter.
Please come help us, Jupiter. Venus can't do it alone. We need both the benefics in here to mediate this whole situation.
Yeah, for sure. I'm kind of looking forward to Jupiter coming back for a little bit. Kind of like all Saturn, is a little can be a little rough. Speaking of which, I mean, I think that it's notable or interesting that Katie has Jupiter and Saturn in Libra conjunct natally. So I mean, I feel like the two are used to working together for Katie. So I mean, I think that I think relief is on the way. But I would say, in the meantime, sort of my remediative advice. Mars. I think when like Mars energy is being like suppressed or constrained or restricted, which I think shows up in Katie's chart natally. So Saturn is ruling Mars in Aquarius. There's like a kind of a sign-based trine there, which is generally a more cooperative aspect. But Saturn, it's out of sect. It's exalted, but it's still a little bit more difficult, even through a trine. Like there is some restriction and restraining that Mars is always going to be kind of dealing with in a Saturn ruled sign, especially if it's well configured to it. It's more constructive, more positive, but maybe not always subjectively easy. I think that restriction and restraint can build up. I think that it takes a lot of energy to restrain Mars. While like pent up energy can kind of manifest as like depression, or even like low energy, like you need like a raw outlet for Mars. Personally, my preferred method of remediation is a punching bag. I find that it sort of like opens my channels up when I sort of lay in to my punching bag and throw some Mars energy at it. Sort of like getting that raw Mars energy out to make way for, a little more of a balanced, Mars that you can apply to writing projects or more mundane affairs, getting the dishes done. I know you have a Saturn ruled Mars. Granted, you have the exalted Saturn ruled Mars. I, as well as Katie, I have a Mars in Aquarius, so it's a little bit more of the challenging Saturn ruled Mars, but I do think you get similar themes. Maybe Mars doesn't like to be as constrained in Aquarius. I don't think it likes air signs as much in general. It doesn't really do as great with mind stuff.
I like your point about restraining energy takes energy. And what looks on the surface like like calm inside can actually feel very fatiguing, trying to maintain that state of calm.
Yeah.
And I think when there is desire or energy that wants to be expressed somehow and it's been held down for so long, that can manifest as that sense of pointlessness. Like, I've given up caring because every time I try to let this out or try to get this ball rolling, something gets in the way.
I think, too, Katie describing the sort of I don't care sort of feeling, which, feeling similarly, it takes like some effort to kind of get up and going. Sometimes I think that is sort of like the face that we paint on Mars's I don't give a fuck energy, And I think that's sort of what needs an outlet. Because I don't think that's how, any of us want to feel regularly. But, if we don't have an outlet for it, if we don't have an outlet for the aggression that Mars points to, I think with Mars and Aquarius specifically, because Saturn's like so negating and so, particularly in Aquarius, is kind of more on the idea plane, that Mars will just kind of say, nah, I'm not going to show up to that party. I don't really like it, Like Mars in Aquarius shows aggression by walking out of the room, which is kind of like a passive aggression. So if you can find something to like be actively aggressive towards that is safe and healthy and constructive, I think that some of that blockage will clear. But I also think that the energy is about to shift. As Mars sort of gets away from that opposition from Saturn and kind of hits Uranus, which is it doing that now? Is that like exact? 21. It's on its way. It's close. Uh, Surely by the time this gets out, it'll have passed. But I think that's the point when like Mars is kind of it's separating from the opposition and is a little more on the Uranus side. When you'll get more of that like Mars energy coming through, and I think you may not get a choice. You might if you're not finding like appropriate channels, you might start snapping, at people. Hopefully not publicly in the 10th house. But I did want to mention real quick. I found it really interesting that Bill Cosby being released from prison. When I looked at his chart, his Uranus return is going exact. Like literally, it might even be separating from it now. Like within days of going exact. So that kind of surprised me a little bit with like Mars, Uranus. I mean, it seems like kind of constraining, and like I think maybe Uranus has like a little more dominant in the configuration as far as Bill Cosby is concerned. Not speaking, talk about his guilt or innocence really, but you're getting more of that liberation end of Uranus. And I guess that's like the big theme is that I think that there is potential for liberation, even in like a difficult malefic T-square. I think it's sort of begging for something to be liberated, and that could be more constructive or more negative. Maybe you have a car. like imagine having like a car that you're leasing that you're like, I'm paying way too much for this. This is costing way too much money. That could look like crashing it and maybe getting out of it that way, which is, a little less productive, or you could, find somebody to sort of take over that lease for you, or, get sort of some sort of trade-in arrangement, car dealership. Katie kind of brought up sustainability, right? Did you already say something about that? Or
About sustainability?
mm-hmm.
I mean, I mentioned burnout.
Burnout, yeah, for sure. I think that's, yeah, it's kind of like the burnout point. I think for a lot of people.
I mean, that makes sense too. Like getting to a point in the pandemic where a lot of people are vaccinated and things are opening back up. Which is, I'm in Canada, so that's happening a little bit more slowly here, but it is happening. Um, all of the sort of frustration and pressure that has built up, during that time, there is that, sense of wanting to be released and a sense of fear and, all that kind of stuff that's happening on a collective level for us all right now. And, I think some of us, I'm definitely in the camp of people who put, perhaps too much pressure on myself during lockdown to sort of make something of that time. While, living through a global pandemic, which is an extremely stressful thing for all of us to live through. So, that kind of pressure, when undergoing a lot of external stress at the same time, can reach a breaking point. And, sometimes when we're feeling that and we look at the transits and we see things that resonate with that feeling, it's a sign that it's actually time to take a break. It's okay to take a break. It's okay to relax. And, you know, with the way this is playing out in your chart, Katie, affecting all of the angular houses, basically, your identity, your home and family, your relationships, and your career and public life and your coworkers, all that stuff is relevant to these transits moving through your chart. And if there is tension between those areas of life, that takes a lot of time to sort of tease all that out. And work out your priorities, and where some of those areas of life might be interfering with priorities in the other ones in a negative way. It takes time, and it's okay to just take a vacation from it. Take all the time you need to process it.
Yeah. I think you brought up a good point about like the pressure. I was thinking like what kind of pressure is sustainable? Obviously you need like a certain amount of pressure to propel things forward. But when that reaches like a critical point where it's too much, like gas in a pipe, it explodes and creates a big ball of fire in the ocean. that, is able to sustain itself, I think that like might tell anybody something maybe about who has maybe planets significantly configured to that pattern. That there's something there that needs to be released in a constructive way rather than a destructive one. But you have to hit the release valve, supposed for waiting for the explosion to happen, or stop putting so much gas in the pipe. But yeah, I think with that, do we want to move on to our next question?
Sounds good. And on the topic of malefics, Keith has just dug a 100-foot, 2-foot deep trench through the yard and is now breaking into the foundation of our house. So that's as usual.
How do
The
you feel about
malefics
that?
are around me. Oh, I feel great about it.
Okay.
He's running electricity out to future chicken coop. So
That's badass.
yeah.
That's a constructive Mars Saturn opposition.
Yes, it is. All right. So our next question comes from Sammy, who has a grand trine in the water signs in their birth chart and wants to know more about what grand trines mean, or what their grand trine specifically means. So a grand trine, obviously represents a chain of support in a chart. And while it looks very beautiful and dramatic, something I find with trines is that they can actually be very subtle. We have a real tendency to notice things that are not working, or that are not going well, or that are challenging. And when things are going smoothly, there's a tendency that we all have, that this is universal, I believe, to sort of take that for granted. It's like when you get a bad flu or a bad cold, that feeling when you start feeling better again, and you're like, I am never going to take for granted just feeling normal ever again. But we all do, right? Like we forget how good it feels to just feel normal until we have a cold again. So I think a grand trine can be a little bit like that. It can be a little quiet. It can be a little subtle. You have to kind of do some thinking to tease out how it shows up in your life, because it's often things underlying the structures of your life that just tend to go okay, and so they're hard to see. But the condition of the planets involved in a grand trine is also important to note, because trines are indicative of support. If you have a planet that's in kind of rough shape in your chart, and it's supporting a planet that's also in kind of rough shape, that can look a little bit more like enabling than like constructive support. Kyle, do you want to say anything sort of more generally about the grand trine as a configuration?
Yeah. So I think, like you said, a grand trine, points to most of the time support. Like you were saying, like we don't necessarily notice the things that go well in our lives as much as we notice kind of the big problems. Like squares are more like direct confrontations, and depending on the type of person you are, some people I hear that these people exist that notice how lovely the sun is being out today, or how nice the flowers smell. I know that those people do exist. I think for the rest of us, when something's going smoothly, we're like, oh yeah, that's just kind of there. But I mean, it does speak to cooperation and support, and there's kind of like a feedback loop of it too, when you see like a grand trine like that. I think kind of what you're saying too, like the conditions of those planets matter a lot, but I also really look at reception too, like what kind of reception is taking place with those planets. I don't know if you're going to get into that a little bit, but it does look like there's quite a bit of it taking place.
Yeah. I will start a little more generally, and then I think move into the details, because you want to get into the nitty gritty and look at which planets are involved and what they're saying to each other. But I will say sort of more broadly that the trine is an aspect that has the nature of Jupiter, and so it has this quality of bestowing blessing or favor. Sort of like someone in a position of great influence, or someone with great wisdom, or a lot of resources is able to sort of bless people with this wisdom or with these resources. And you also want to look at obviously the houses that are involved in the Grand Trine, and in Sam's case, that's the first, the fifth, and the ninth. And so what you have is a chain of support between the first house, which is identity and self-expression and personal agency, and the fifth house, which is creativity, and the ninth house, which is spirituality and higher learning and all the ways that we sort of transcend what we're normally capable of seeing or understanding, whether that's through study or through spiritual practice or through exploration, through travel, that kind of stuff. So you've got this supportive configuration between those three areas of your life. And then if you want to get more into the details of what's happening in the Grand Trine, it's important to look at which planets are earlier in zodiacal order, because that's how you can see what direction the chain of support is moving in through the Grand Trine. Planets that are, if a planet is making an aspect to another planet, the planet that is earlier in zodiacal order. So, say for example, in this Grand Trine, Mercury is in Cancer and Jupiter is in Scorpio. So Cancer is earlier in the series of signs than Scorpio is. And the planet that is earlier is going to be the one with more influence in the configuration. So that planet is the bestower of the blessing that's characterized by the trine. That planet is in a position of offering help and support to the planet that's later in zodiacal order.
I do tend to... Sorry, I want to interrupt you.
No, please do.
I agree with that. I also, I sort of look at, too, the planet that's earlier in zodiacal order. It has, it is kind of the bestower, but it also can call upon, the other planet, too. Like it's sort of in charge, kind of like what you were saying of the nature of Jupiter. Jupiter, I often think of as like a patron or has a bunch of stuff to offer, wisdom, money, but they can also, being the patron or the bestower of the good, can call upon you to like, oh, hey, can you, you're a musician. Can you write a song for my niece? It's her birthday, But anyway, not to cut you off.
No, that's a really, really good point, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it's not like it only goes one way if there's an aspect. It does go both ways, but there is one planet that tends to, have the sort of play that role of being more of the leader in the configuration. So if we move through the trine in your chart, Sam, in zodiacal order, we start with Mercury, trine Jupiter, and here you have Mercury in the first house. So there is self-expression supporting creativity, supporting artistic creativity, supporting fun and recreation. The fifth house is the party house. It's the fun house. It's where we do things that feel good. And then as you move along, you have Jupiter supporting Saturn, and Saturn's in the ninth house. So you see, the fifth house, this creativity, supporting spirituality, supporting higher learning, supporting exploration, and then Saturn supporting Mercury. And because I know something about the context of Sam's life, I'm focusing on the spirituality signification of the ninth house here in particular. That spirituality then supports self-expression, supporting Mercury in the first house. The most interesting detail I've noticed about this specific Grand Trine is the configuration between Jupiter and Saturn within it. Jupiter is actually bonifying Saturn, because Jupiter is in, what's called the superior position, being earlier in zodiacal order, Jupiter is bestowing that favor upon Saturn and can also ask Saturn for things. Um, and Saturn
Jupiter
in
rules Saturn too.
and there's reception. Saturn is in Pisces. Saturn is in Jupiter's sign. So that's like a very, very positive configuration between these two. Jupiter is playing host to Saturn because Saturn is in Jupiter's sign. And because there's a positive configuration that, Saturn's stay in Jupiter's house is, perhaps that of a well-liked guest. Saturn's going to be taken care of in this situation. And, to get some details of how that would actually look, or what areas of life to look for that theme playing out, you'd look at the houses they're in, which I've briefly touched on. You can also look at the houses they rule. In particular, I was looking at the houses that Saturn rules because Saturn's the one being bona fide, and Saturn rules the seventh house and the eighth house. So, the seventh house obviously is relationships. The eighth house usually shows up as, other people's resources, and some darker connotations, obviously. But, those topics are being given some support by Jupiter. And that doesn't mean that those topics are always easy. Jupiter's actually being maltreated through an opposition with Mars, who's the out of sect malefic. So Mars is the most challenging planet in this chart. So Jupiter, is trying.
I mean, there is reception with that opposition. Mars rules Jupiter in Scorpio.
Yes, there is reception between them. So it's, a much easier opposition than it could otherwise be, but it's still challenging. Jupiter still has, and Jupiter's retrograde. Jupiter still has, some challenges to deal with. And Saturn, no matter how well configured or well placed, is a challenging planet. Saturn doesn't represent things that are easy. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the topics of those two houses are always easy. And being ruled by Saturn, getting good things out of those houses can still take more time because Saturn does not do anything quickly. And has very high standards for what they will let into those houses in your life. But it nonetheless is a good place to look if you're thinking, where do I look for support in my life around these topics? That aspect from Jupiter can give you some insight into things that might support relationships and support, we all end up in debt of some kind, at some point in our lives, which is something the eighth house represents. Jupiter, is optimism and faith and spirituality. And because I think spirituality is a big component of this grand trine in general and of the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn, I would expect that things like artistic creativity, which is in the fifth house, as well as, spirituality, divination, those are topics that would be supportive of what Saturn is trying to do in your chart and, ruling the seventh and eighth.
Yeah. I guess I'm on that topic. It's making me think of student loan debt. It's like Saturn in the ninth, ruling the eighth. I wonder if there is a lot of student loan debt, but I would tend to think that that's going to go better. Like, I would say if, this person was asking, like, I want to study this, but, I have to take on so much debt to get that degree or get that series of degrees. I don't know if it's worth it. I would say that's probably worth it. I mean, it's probably going to work out. The other thing I can't help but, there's a bunch of really interesting stuff about this chart because, Jupiter, so Mercury being in the first house in that trine with Jupiter, there's some reception there since Jupiter, exalts in the sign of Cancer. It being in the fifth house, like I don't know, that whole configuration, like seems like really good for storytelling. It might be like a very, particularly like Jupiter in Scorpio, for some reason, I always think of kind of like suspense, like being I don't know, like knowing how to like foster suspense effectively. Like Alfred Hitchcock had Jupiter in Scorpio. I think Stephen King did too. Like very good storytellers. And Mercury has its joy in the first. Like somebody who like likes to talk, or likes to maybe more comfortable speaking publicly. Maybe not. 'Cause Mercury is retrograde, but I think what also maybe reinforces that to me, going off on the wrong track, but that mutual reception with Mercury and the Moon. I know we're talking about the Grand Trine, the Water Trine, but there is kind of a Grand Earth Trine too. It's not super tight by aspect, but they have planets in all of the Earth signs: Mars and Taurus, the Moon in Virgo in the third, and Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn. So there's kind of like a, what do they call that? It seems like a spider web or something, but like a more pleasant spider web. But like the Moon, the Moon's in its joy in the third, Mercury's in its joy in the first, and kind of Mercury having like Jupiter to lean on. It could be even like latent storytelling ability or something, like because Mercury and Jupiter are both retrograde. Yeah, I mean Saturn too, being in the ninth house, it isn't kind of the overcoming trine with Mercury, but I would say that Saturn's in pretty good condition. Gonna I think traditionally even like Mercury Saturn aspects were to be kind of like stabilizing, sort of give Mercury more direction, a little more.
Yeah, I've something that I learned early on in my astrology studies. I had a teacher tell me it's better to have any aspect between
Yeah.
Saturn and Mercury than none, because Saturn can really ground Mercury and organize Mercury. Um, and it's interesting that Mercury rules the third house and Saturn is in the ninth house, which, seems like a nice aspect for someone with a great deal of spiritual insight, but also
Mm-hmm.
a good student. These are both houses that are relevant to the topic of school and also the
Yeah.
topic of spirituality. Mercury's trying to manage that third house for you. Mercury's in charge of that. So getting some support from Saturn, especially when Saturn's in the ninth, is definitely, an ally
Mm-hmm.
in those areas of life. And will help with, third house stuff and ninth house stuff and Mercury stuff. Um, all that kind of stuff. It's pretty easy to become unglued. Um, when you're really really stretching your mind to its limits, whether that's through study or through spiritual exercises or mystical experiences. So
I bet you there's a lot
yeah,
of that.
I would betcha. So having Saturn there to ground those areas of life, and focus things, I think is really, really important. Saturn is a good BS detector, and can, help you with
Mm.
discernment and, can help you, when Mercury is taking on, too many interests, Saturn can kind of narrow that a little bit and keep Mercury on task.
Yeah, I think Mercury in Cancer too kind of tends to talk in circles sometimes, and I think that Saturn can help that out a little bit too. We have these kind of two oppositions too. The Moon is applying to an opposition with Saturn, which that's a pretty challenging aspect. And we have that Mars Jupiter opposition. But what I like about that Grand Trine and the way it's configured to those oppositions, like it's kind of in a position to, I like to think of those, if there's an opposition between two planets and like a trine and sextile, respectively, with another planet, that planet can sort of serve as a mediator. Um, I like to think of it as like a translating a mediator. Like, these two planets are having a conflict, and this third planet, has a more cooperative relationship with both of them and can kind of think of like two thinking of like high school. I don't know, like two friends are having an argument and like the third friend can talk to both of them and be like, hey, Shirley thinks your backflips are really great on the cheerleading team. And Catherine's like, oh, I didn't know she felt that way about me cheerleading. And, like, I don't know, like they're maybe able to like open dialogue between the two, facilitate it a little more.
Yeah, and I mean, just looking at the big picture of all those aspects and how they relate to each other, the way the oppositions are getting a bit of help from that Grand Trine and from the harmonious aspect patterns that are going on in this chart makes me wonder if, maybe there's a skill for mediation, or
Mm,
a tendency to find mediators when they're necessary. That's perhaps a theme that's going on, and I'd have to dive into the weeds a little bit, to dig out details of how that might look more specifically, but just in a broader sense, like could indicate a skill for conflict resolution or a tendency to, find people who do have that skill when it's necessary to employ it. Doesn't mean there's no conflict, but accessing those mediation skills, whether within yourself or from other people, is perhaps something that's helping when there are challenges and conflict.
yeah. Yeah. I would say that, I mean, it does point to there being conflict.
Yeah.
But even, what, that's what I love about, actually, it's one of it's like my personal keywords with Jupiter and Scorpio. It's like the gaining wisdom through conflict. Uh, God, there's so much here too that points to like divination or like occult wisdom, occult knowledge. Like, I keep thinking too of is it not Dorotheus? Who's the Egyptian?
Rhetorius.
Rhetorius.
Rhetorius, the Egyptian.
Yes, Rhetorius the Egyptian says that Saturn and Mercury in aspect make astrologers. I don't know if if they have an interest in astrology specifically. I mean, they're asking a question to a couple of astrologers about their chart, so probably answers that. But they might be potentially very gifted astrologers if they chose to go that way.
Yep, or tarot, or
Tarot for sure.
any other form of divination, and also that eighth house connection with Saturn ruling the eighth house from the ninth also makes me think of mediumship.
Yeah.
Talking to spirits, talking to the departed, feeling a spiritual connection with the departed, with ancestors, doing ancestor work, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. They're all like very visible. That whole configuration, it's all has like a kind of a clean relationship with the ascendant.
Yeah. Yeah, so it has a lot of opportunity to actually be personally expressed, and there's an extent to which, I mean, if a grand trine was happening between supporting houses, like, the 11th house was involved, and, the symbolism of that might have more to do with other people or circumstances in the environment giving you support, and not necessarily something that, you naturally consciously take hold of. Whereas, with Mercury in the first house being involved, there's kind of an opportunity for this grand trine to be expressed in the personality, and for the strengths and resources that it represents, being able to really consciously take hold of that, and like kind of a good sign that the decisions that you make with your own agency are probably sound, because that's what the first house is all about, is your own decisions. So if this is the kind of support that your chart is giving you, then I feel like that's a good indication that like you're probably on the right track when you make choices.
Yeah. I would say that, yeah, can your big decision making planets are well situated, especially the ruler of the first,
Yeah.
being the moon in its joy in the third, that awesome, really badass mutual reception with Mercury. I'm I love that. That's awesome. Again, you know what? I'm thinking about it. Like, if they're really into tarot, maybe Uh, a lot of tarot to me, my experience with it is storytelling. It's being able to connect, the cards together and pull a story out of that, resonates with people. Yeah, I would say probably a very gifted tarot card reader if it's something that they're into.
Yeah, I mean, the whole major arcana is just, one long narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's a divinatory art that lends itself very well to narrative.
Yeah. Which, I mean, astrology, I feel like is similar too,
Oh yeah.
pulling meaning from the symbols.
Yeah, and figuring out, what kind of stories they're telling. You've got your characters and they're all having their dialogue with each other, and how are they moving the plot forward, or
Mm-hmm.
which ones are foils to the others. There are
Yeah.
always all kinds of stories going on in a birth chart.
Mm-hmm. Just thinking, not that almost trying to like counteract a little bit. I always have to do that the way my brain works. Like, look for what could possibly be negative about this. Um, and the only thing I can think of, I guess, with like that, Grand Trine specifically, is like the could be like a tendency to look for drama in the story. I don't know, create drama in the story. I don't know. There's
I feel like Saturn's probably going to rein that in, though.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
it. The Saturn's not very pro drama.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I sort of like that. I mean, I think they could if they wanted to. Jupiter could be like, "Come on, Saturn, let me just embellish this like a little bit."
That's true. Jupiter has a lot of power here to push Saturn around.
I kind of see Jupiter as having like the most sort of power in that Grand Trine.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like the right kind of drama. Just add like a little suspense, a little,
Well, in the fifth house too,
for the dramatic.
because that's about fun.
Yeah,
You've got Jupiter in the fifth, definitely like big on good times.
Yeah,
And with the Mars ruled fifth, what those good times are might be a little unconventional.
yeah, for sure. Thinking too, and I keep may or may not be a tarot card reader, but they are. Um, I've been to several. For a while, I was like getting readings all the time, and some of them were just like too. I like the ones that like made it fun. I don't know, that like were fun and easy to be with. I don't know, like some were like a little too serious, a little too like business like, like and then there were those that were like a little too kooky, a little too um, fluffy and like
A little too woo woo.
yeah. And I think that with Saturn kind of in the mix there, and even like Mars, that opposition with Jupiter, which I don't think is like the end of the world. I would actually say, if anything, like that, Mars being kind of configured to all of it. Like Mars is very like, yeah, tarot, cool. Does it do something though? Like, does it accomplish a goal, a task? You kind of get like that fun Jupiter energy that could like, make it interesting, spice it up, make it a little, whatever, fun, suspenseful. I don't know. Like you get that like strong spiritual component, but you also get like a grounded kind of practical component with Mars and Saturn. Like it's very, very balanced. I think that's what I like about Grand Trines is they tend to indicate balance.
Yeah, it's a very self-regulating aspect pattern.
Self-regulating is a
I
very
mean,
good term.
that's one of the characteristics of Jupiter is balance.
Yeah.
And stabilization, with aspect patterns that involve squares and oppositions, things become unbalanced or, go to extremes really quickly. Whereas with a grand trine, anywhere that, something might reach an extreme, it's kind of kept in check by the configuration to the other planets so that nothing really goes too far. Nothing really crosses the line.
Yeah.
It's very moderated.
Yeah, Jupiter can see everything too. Almost just about everything. Which I like in a day chart. The more Jupiter can see in day charts, the better.
Definitely.
But yeah, I mean that's all I can really think about just going off the aspect pattern in of itself. Is there anything you have to add, Tristan?
No, I think we're good.
All right. Well, I think with that, we will call it a day here. So anyone interested in a full consultation, you can go to my website at kylepierceastrology.com and book an appointment. Having recently opened for consultations, my introductory rates are pretty low right now. So, that's not going to last forever. I'm also in a bit of a gap period with my other podcast, Pillow Cosmos.
Oh, I would listen to that
Pillow
podcast. Oh my God. That sounds exactly what I mean.
Yeah. It sounds good right now. Pillow Cosmos. Killer Cosmos. I am waiting to receive a birth chart or a birth certificate for child serial killer Mary Bell. And I'm dying to find out, what her birth time is. I really got to know what child serial killer looks like. That's just me and my malefic 10th house ruler. But outside of that, what do you have going on, Tristan?
I am also opening up for consultations. You can find out more about that on my website, which is badsignastrology.ca. And I have an Instagram at badsignastrology. So, please feel free to check me out there.
Awesome. Well, we will sign off for today. Best of luck to you, Katie, in enduring the Saturn-Mars-Uranus T-square. We'll pass. At least I'm telling myself that every day. No, seriously, it will. And thanks for sharing your chart with us, Sammy.
Yeah, thank you both very much for your questions.
All right. Well, we will see you all next time. If you have a question you would like to have answered on the Astrology Hotline, you can submit a question by email to astrologyhotlinepod@gmail.com.